This is Charles Thomas at the Hilton Plaza Inn at the Jerry Litton primary election party. And with me now is John Ashford, who is Jerry Litton's campaign director. And Mr. Ashford, just a few moments ago, you made an announcement from the podium here. I'd like for you to repeat that announcement for our TV5 audience.
Charles, the announcement is very simple, that the party's over. The plane which Congressman Litton was to have flown to Kansas City on tonight to this party has crashed on takeoff from Chillicothe. The plane has been identified. There were 6 occupants in the plane. There were no survivors.
Sheriff, what happened at the airport tonight?
We couldn't determine as to what happened. We did have a plane wreck, and there were 6 people killed in it.
Do you know who those 6 were?
Yes, at this time it was Mr. and Mr. Litton, and I presume her 2 children. Now, they have been identified by the local dentist here.
Good evening. I'm Jim Steer, along with Tony DeHaro. Death is always, under all circumstances, a tragedy. For if it is not, then it means that life itself has become one. And the death of Jerry Litton and his family is indeed a tragedy. For his parents, who are in seclusion today, his friends, and the thousands of Missourians who wanted Jerry Litton to be their next U.S. Senator. After last night's fiery plane crash, that will never be. A sign on the outskirts of Chillicothe, Missouri reads, "Welcome to Chillicothe, home of Jerry Litton, our next U.S. Senator." Today, an American flag flew at half-staff behind the sign mourning the death of the Democratic Senate nominee. Last night, TV5's Tony DeHaro and our eyewitness minicam arrived in the north-central Missouri town. And they found an unbelievable sight, Tony, a burned plane and 6 bodies.
That's right, Jim. When, the TV5 crew arrived in Chillicothe, we went directly to the airport. There were cars lining the road, state policemen keeping the curious at a distance. Then we went on to the Livingston County Courthouse, and it was almost 2 in the morning, but the courthouse was full. A vote-counting party had been planned. That party was never held. But no one went home. The faces were tired, lined with sadness. For Jerry Litton, he was more than their congressman, more than the local millionaire rancher. Jerry Litton was a neighbor. And though most had not been out to the airport and actually seen the disaster site firsthand, they all had their own personal mental picture. They were trying to reconcile the Jerry Litton they knew to the twisted wreckage they also knew was at the airport. The twisted wreckage that held the secret of why Jerry Litton, his wife and 2 children, plus their other neighbor, Paul Rupp Jr. and his son, why did they die?
The Federal Aviation Administration investigators say they really don't know what happened. The gear was in place, the plane was charred. They do know that 6 people died as they headed from Jerry Litton's home in Chillicothe to a Kansas City victory rally, a rally to signify Litton's winning the Democratic nomination for the U.S. Senate. One of those who knew Jerry Litton well was Madeline Hawkins, the clerk of courts, the lady at the Livingston County Courthouse who was counting the votes, who was presiding over the local festivities. She told us how the news hit home.
Then we heard the fire engine run. It must have been something about 9:15 or 20 after, and of course we think not much of that because it had run once today, and then we heard other sirens run, and then the first thing we knew, someone said that there had been a plane crash out the airfield, and then the next thing we knew, they told us it was the Rupp plane, and then the next thing they told us that Rupp's was to take Litton, Jerry, and Sharon to Kansas City tonight. And the next thing they told us there were 6 that were burned, and of course we couldn't find out who they were for a while for sure. Kind of broke up our party.
The Livingston County Sheriff, Kelsey Reeder, was one of the first to arrive at the crash scene. Were you close to the wreckage?
Yes, I was helped get the bodies out of it.
What did you see when you got there, sir?
Well, as the bare frame of the plane, it had burned, and the occupants were still approximately in their seats, which we took them out of there after the fire cooled down after we could get to it.
Could you tell who was sitting where?
Yes, they were all in their individual seats, but there's no way you could identify any of them. They were burned so bad that you couldn't recognize none of them.
The final identification of the dead was made by dental records, the bodies taken to a funeral home. Funeral will be held Friday at 3 p.m. in Chillicothe. It will be at least 2 weeks before investigators have the first clue as to the real cause of the crash. But for Chillicothe, Missouri, for those who voted for Jerry Litton, It will all be academic.
Hundreds of Litton supporters and loved ones were awaiting the congressman's arrival at the Hilton Plaza Inn, where an election night celebration was planned. TV5's Charles Thomas and our Live Eye mini-cam were at the plaza to do just a routine election story, which soon had all the makings of a tragedy. And I want to hear more about that, Charles. What happened just before?
Jim, it was an unbelievable scene from start to finish. To many, Jerry Litton had done the impossible. He had come from behind in his run for the Senate nomination. He had beaten the political odds makers. He had defied the political bosses, who they may be, to win the nomination and to win it from western Missouri. This was the impossible for many. Then the news of the tragedy, another impossibility. Nobody wanted to believe this impossibility, but soon that came true, and it was...
Which leads me to this, Charles. There were, what, 350 strong supporters of Mr. Litton there. And I noticed in our Live Eye pickup, while you were making the announcement that you had just previously heard yourself over the loudspeaker that they had also heard, they were stunned looking at you. They were seeing it live on television. Did that happen?
I think that's something that we learned from this, that people will believe television before they will believe reality in some cases. And this is the way it struck me. It was a study, also it was a study in emotions, ups and downs. You had people happy, joyous. We won after a year of campaigning, and then all of a sudden we don't have anything. Some of the campaign workers had been with Jerry Litton since 1971. They helped him in his first run for the United States Congress, and they were looking for the Senate bid, and it was all gone.
Now, Ashford kind of took charge, didn't he, and orchestrated things after the announcements were coming out. Who really...
It was chaos. I don't think Ashford really gained control until later on. I'm sure he found it hard to believe for some time.
But he was having private conferences with the members of the family,
Surely, but no one would accept it at the beginning. It had to soak in. It was an impossible tragedy. No one expected something like this.
A lot of people were crying. The emotions certainly were open to everybody.
Women were shrieking. Men were crying. It was an unbelievable scene, Jim, from beginning till end.
Maybe we can relive some of that tragedy.
Will you join me in a moment of prayer? God of our fathers and our God, we pause now to ask of you mercy and grace and understanding, peace of heart and mind for aching hearts and anguished souls. We pray for the members of this family with whom we are concerned, that all might be strengthened by your presence and your love. But we also thank you, O God, for the zeal and for the inspiration and for the drive and for the leadership expressed to many, those here tonight and many elsewhere across the state and nation, in the life you have invested in Jerry Litton. And so as we pause now, we realize that you have given us a great gift in this person, his family, and we pray that if at this hour you might sustain them and guide them, we are most grateful. If, oh God, this means the conclusion of a life and a career, yet we again offer our appreciation for what you have done for all of us. And so now we ask for your peace of heart and mind for each of us, wisdom and strength to do the things needful in the morrow, and the desire to proceed with that work which you have yet for us here to do. In the name and for the sake of the great physician, Jesus Christ. Amen.
That was a eulogy given just moments after the announcement was made that indeed Congressman Litton and his family were dead. Jacob Wolf, press secretary for the Missourians for Litton, probably knew Jerry Litton as well as anyone. He knew his family well, too, his lovely wife Sharon, and their children, Linda and Scott. TV5's Leanna Joyce has him in our studio tonight, and here's her report.
One of Jerry Litton's greatest talents was the way he related to people. He made those around him feel very special, and in turn he won their loyalties. So it's easy to understand why he had such a devoted staff. I know he did because as a reporter I came into frequent contact with them. One of the men closest to Mr. Litton was Jake Wolf, his press secretary. Mr. Wolf is with us this evening to talk about Jerry Litton. Mr. Wolf, first of all, how did you become associated with Mr. Litton?
Well, I've been a long-time personal friend of John Ashford, the campaign manager. And John called me along toward the end of April and asked me if I was interested in joining the Litton campaign. I was living in Jefferson City at the time, and John was in Washington, D.C., and he said, "Are you interested?" And I said, "I'm interested in talking." And I said, as long as we have an understanding that there's no commitment from Jerry Litton, then there's no commitment from me, let's talk. That was about 4:15 in the afternoon. He was in Washington, and I was in Jefferson City. And at 9 o'clock that night, he was sitting in my living room in Jefferson City.
How did you find him to work for?
He worked hard. One of the things we stressed in the campaign was that the American people, the people of Missouri, should revive the work ethic, because it was one of the things on which this country was founded. And that was the way Jerry Litton lived. I remember one time we went to Washington, D.C., and we found people working in his office at 11:30 at night. That was his Washington congressional office. And of course, in the campaign organization, we had people who came on duty at midnight and worked until 9 in the morning. This is difficult for others to understand, but this was his character.
Of course, it was very tragic. His entire family was killed. His entire family in recent weeks had been campaigning very hard on behalf of him. What was their feeling about his running for political office?
They approved of it. They were for it. And they were excited, and they were very proud of Jerry. This included Shirley Litton's parents, who also were campaigning. And there was complete enthusiasm in the family.
What was it like last night for you, the staff members, to hear that Jerry Litton had been killed in a plane crash, that the dream had come to such an abrupt end?
Well, of course, you can live a lifetime and never experience anything like that. And I had never experienced it in 20 years in the news business. Nothing like this had ever happened to me. I had always reported when it happened to someone else. My first reaction was that, Jake, don't trust your senses, because you did hear wrong. And let's run that through again. And I didn't panic. I kept thinking, if you can get to the right person on the telephone, somebody can tell you that it really isn't as bad as it might be. And time kept passing. Pretty hard evidence started coming in. But still, I was playing the string. I questioned the sheriff and the highway patrol. I said, has it been confirmed that it was an airplane that was taking off that crashed? Possibly a plane took off and another plane came in and landed. But hard evidence started coming in, and the more time that passed, the more evident it became that if Jerry had landed, he would have telephoned or walked through the door, and this did not occur.
We all shared your tragedy last night. Thank you, Mr. Wolf, for joining us. Back to you, Jim.
Democratic officials in Missouri are pondering an unwanted and politically sensitive task: choosing a nominee for the U.S. Senate to replace Congressman Litton. Secretary of State James Kirkpatrick says politicking has already commenced for the nomination. Kirkpatrick confirmed today that state law provides the Democratic and requires the Democratic State Committee to act. Democratic State Chairman John McElroy scheduled a meeting Saturday in Jefferson City, but will not indicate at this time if any action will be taken then. Jerry Litton, as we all know, was a tireless campaigner. He frequently traveled around the state, making friends and gathering momentum for his Democratic senatorial bid. Ed Hunt has been on the campaign trail with Litton, and of course he reminisces with the man and some of his strategy. Ed?
Jim, he was quite a strategist, and he was quite a campaigner. This was Jerry Litton, the campaigner, a fighter, a skilled politician, hard-working, determined, and backed by a well-organized campaign. He wanted very much to be a United States Senator, so he went after the seat being vacated by Stuart Symington. And in one of the most vigorous campaigns this state has seen in a long time, he won the Democratic Party's nomination, running well ahead of his nearest opponent. The 39-year-old congressman won without the support of party bosses and big-name endorsements, and he liked it that way. He reflected that once as he looked ahead to victory.
I'll be going to Washington without the support of the so-called political bosses and special interest groups, because this campaign, like my earlier ones, is absent of the traditional political endorsements and the support of various special interest groups. You know, when you go to Washington with the endorsement of political bosses, they ask for a lot in return. But when the people send you there, they don't ask for very much in return, just good government. And that's the exciting part of this. If I go there, I won't be indebted to those who ask for an awful lot in return, just people.
Litton started campaigning for the Senate early, even before he officially declared. His critics, many of whom were politicians, said he had had his eye on the Senate for some time, since he first ran for office in 1972. And they expressed a guarded fear of him, for he was a newcomer, a challenger to the established political structure, and he didn't like playing the political game by the old political rules.
I just don't enjoy going around kissing the backside of political bosses. I take my campaign to the people. I did it the first time. I got reelected by 80% without their support. I'm running for the Senate now. Somebody said, gee, you're not getting endorsements. Well, we're not really spending that kind of time trying to get political bosses to be with us. I'm spending my time with the people. They're the ones that are going to vote, and they're the ones I want to represent anyway.
Litton frequently brought to this part of the state men like himself, newcomers, potential decision makers, and potential power brokers. And whatever you thought of dialogue with Litton, there was no denying that he gave Missourians a chance to meet and talk with some of the nation's leaders and potential leaders. But when Litton decided to run for the Democratic nomination for the Senate, even his TV show came under criticism as a campaign tool. He expected it, and he never took the criticism really seriously. As a congressman and a campaigner, Litton liked to portray himself as a people's candidate, a populist. He sought out those issues that were most interesting to the people, and he championed them. In this interview with TV5's Jerry Gosa, his target was the big oil companies, whom he suspected of some dishonesty.
Major oil companies are buying ads all over the United States telling the American people to cut down on their gasoline consumption. At the same time, they're twisting arms of these gasoline dealers, threatening a cancellation of their lease if they don't sell more gas. And they're doing nothing more than deceiving the American people. And I'm offended as a congressman that we're told that they're telling people use less gas, and they're threatening lease cancellations if their jobbers don't sell more gas. And I'm very disturbed about it, and we'll look into it with the Federal Trade Commission.
Well, there's also talk of another fuel shortage this winter, while the oil dealers are trying to get rid of their surplus. Do you see this, or you have comment on this?
Well, we've tried. The energy bill that the President vetoed last year would have required the oil companies to turn over information to Congress. We cannot legislate good, responsible legislation in terms of our oil needs in the future unless we know how much oil we have, unless we know how many reserves are there and how available it is to us. And the only people that have that information are oil companies. They won't give it to us. And I think we're going to have legislation to force them to.
As the campaign drew down to the wire, the news media revealed that Congressman Jerry Litton had spent about $1 million in his quest, half of it his personal money. And in no time at all, his opponents and critics zeroed in on him with charges that he was trying to buy the nomination. When the question was put to him, he offered this explanation.
Well, I think it's very interesting to note that the majority of our media occurs from the 20th of July on. And the poll showed that we drew even July 20. And while spending on television, radio, and the media has received considerable press the last few days as being the cause of our surge, I think we have to keep in mind that we were even at the very point when we started the majority of our media campaign. Most of the polls that you've seen were conducted the 19th and 20th. Our television, our radio advertising did not start until yesterday, 8 days after those polls were conducted. Our newspaper advertising will not start until this week, really this week. 80% of our television had not been used as of the 20th. So the majority of our media had not been expended other than a blitz in St. Louis in April and a blitz in Kansas City in May, except, of course, dialogue with Litton.
Litton never denied that he used his money to fight for the nomination. He refused to sign a pledge to limit his campaign spending. He once confessed to TV5 that not only did he start out the underdog, but that all his opponents had the benefit of family name and big political backing, or they had already established their name in statewide with big campaign spending or state offices, and they did not need to spend any more money. He said he had to establish himself with the voters, and he did. It's too early to say if anything can be learned from the tragedy of Litton's death, but as for the success of his campaign, some believe that it's a sign that the political power in Missouri is shifting from the eastern side of the state to the west. Jim?
Ed, we all know that when a man dies an untimely death, a well-known man, he's revered by the public frequently. Dr. Martin Luther King, John Kennedy, and many others. As a journalist, what did you like about Litton? What grabbed you, so to speak?
Well, as a young journalist, I liked Litton's challenging the establishment. I live in Kansas, I live in western Missouri, and I've thought for some time that we should have either a governor or a senator from this side of the state. I'm not saying that the ones we have now who serve don't do a good job. I'm sure they do. But it's just something in having your own. Now, we have our governor and both our senators come from the eastern side of the state. We have not had one from the western side of the state for some time. The political power and the structure on the eastern side of the state. He challenged it. I liked him for having the courage to do that.
Not only did he challenge it, but don't you think he had a way of getting through to people?
Oh, obviously. The fact, well, just look at the vote. He ran so far ahead of his nearest opponent until everybody was describing it not only as a victory, but a surprise victory, which means that he really got to an awful lot of voters.
Well, Ed, I just wonder, you know, in reflecting, we've all, as journalists, I've interviewed Jerry Litton many times. I can recall Jerry bouncing in at KCI and grabbing him on the run, throwing a mic in front of him. And I always found the man, and I can say this now, and I'd say it whether he's alive or dead, he always stopped and said, "What can I do for you, Jim? Can I help you?" And I like that as a journalist.
He realized, as most politicians do, but he seemed to have a keen sense of it, that the news media is very important to a politician. Not only during an election year, but for every message that a politician has to get across to voters. If he's trying to get the people to do something, if he's trying to convince them to support him and an idea, you have to go to the news media. We do have the eyes and ears of the public. Litton realized this. He realized it early, and I think it benefited him in his campaign. It also benefited him as a congressman.
He also had a certain sincerity that I enjoyed, and I know it was real. I felt it.
Oh, yes. He had a touch with people. Well, he was a farmer, and I suspect every farmer, you know, getting out there working in the dirt, you sort of have to have a touch with people and coming in contact with other farmers. He probably developed what they call the common touch, touch for the common man.
Well, he had something, Ed. Thank you very much. Wendell Anschutz visited Jerry Litton before he actively entered the race for Stuart Symington's Senate seat on Place to Place. He talked to the late congressman about his first love, ranching.
There is a distinctive something about the Litton Ranch that jumps out at you as you drive by. The impeccable green-on-white buildings are part of it, and those superbly healthy, stark white cattle are another. But stop in for a visit with Jerry Litton and his father Charlie, and the difference between this spread and the old B-Bar B ranch of the Westerns is even more jolting. For as long as there have been cowboys, there has been something about ranching that seemed to defy the transition to technology. But witness a typical conversation between rancher and cowhand at the Litton Charlet Ranch.
Yeah, they're ready to breed, and I'd like the information about what to breed them to. Number 356 and 148.
356, according to the computer, ought to be bred to the Super Sam 679 bull. And tell you on the other cow, why don't we try this 790 pole bull? I'll be right on out.
It is all there in his office, a closed-circuit display of a cow that calved last night, and in another barn, a billboard of the breeding which is to be accomplished this morning. In that barn, the technology becomes even more space-aged. There is no natural breeding at LCR, only artificial insemination. In this vial of liquid nitrogen, the seeds that will one day become young calves can be held in suspended animation for the lifetime of a cow. In only 7 years on the show circuit, the Littons have stocked a room full of silver. But last year they quit competing, not because they ran out of room, but because they decided they'd found a way of determining the quality of their cattle that no judge can compete with. A computer, which not only can tell every vital statistic about every animal on the ranch at any given moment, but which can also predict with uncanny accuracy the potential of cattle yet unborn. Meanwhile, out in the sales barn, the atmosphere is more like that of an auto showroom. Neat stalls of contented cows serenaded by popular music, a plaque listing the vital statistics and list price of each, and a carpet of AstroTurf. If other businesses can do it, says Litton, why not ranching?
Well, it was a difficult move because we've showed cattle for a good many years, but we're certainly producing far better cattle genetically and getting far more money for them because they're doing a better job for the customer.
And when you drive on, you have the feeling that the days of the Ponderosa are gone forever. Wendell Anschutz, Television 5 Eyewitness News, Chillicothe, Missouri.
Funeral services for the Litton family will be held at 3 p.m. Friday at the United Methodist Church in Chillicothe. Services will be conducted by the Reverend William Lindblom, minister of the First Presbyterian Church. The Littons were actually members of the Presbyterian Church, but funeral services were planned at the Methodist Church because it has more space. There is no fitting eulogy this reporter can give to Congressman Jerry Litton. His entire life of love, humor, and what can I do to help the other guy is his own best eulogy. Congressman Jerry Litton, dead in the prime of life at 39 years of age. I'm Jim Steer for the award-winning Eyewitness News team. Good evening.